Hello and welcome. Today we delve into a story that reveals the brutal transformation of aerial warfare during the Second World War. A story of overwhelming odds, technological marvels, and the inevitable rise of industrial power over individual heroism. Imagine a scene where German pilots, high above Schweinfurt at 25,000 feet, face a sky filled with over 376 American B-17 flying fortresses, shimmering giants of metal and fire, while only 40 German fighters scramble to intercept them. How could such a small force stand against an unstoppable wave of steel? Could the Luftwaffe's once dominant skies be forever lost? And what does this tell us about the true nature of modern warfare? What if I told you that by March of 1943, German pilots like No himself pioneered tactics to drop bombs from fighters directly onto bombers? Yet no innovation could match the relentless industrial juggernaut that was America's war machine. How did the Germans respond to the terrifying reality of 291 bombers crossing deep into their airspace, losing nearly 40 fighters in the process, but shooting down 60 of the enemy? Could elite units, once victorious over France and Britain, truly be overwhelmed by mere numbers? And what happens when factories producing nearly 124,000 barrels of fuel daily are reduced to zero? Yet aircraft production soars to nearly 40,000 in 1944. The central question emerges: is victory in war dictated by skill and bravery, or by the unstoppable force of industrial capacity? How do you fight against a foe whose factories produce over 265 aircraft each day, while your pilots, exhausted and undertrained, struggle with dwindling supplies and mounting losses? How did the German pilots, once the most skilled in the world, come to realize that their skies had turned into a battlefield of numbers and machinery, where individual heroism was rendered meaningless? And what does this shift tell us about the nature of modern warfare, where the fate of nations no longer rests solely on daring exploits, but on the relentless march of factories and logistics? In this video, we will trace the evolution from aerial dominance to catastrophic collapse, deciphering how strategic bombings, fuel shortages, and logistical failures transform the skies into a domain governed by industrial mathematics. We will expose how Germany's miraculous fighter jets, like the Me-262, arrived too late to reverse the tide, and how the once proud Luftwaffe's most elite pilots confronted the brutal truth. Victory belongs to the machine. The story of the German air war is not just about planes and pilots, but about the profound and irreversible shift in the very nature of combat. A relentless, impersonal force where numbers, factories, and systems decide the outcome. The question is, are we witnessing the end of the era of the individual hero in aerial combat, or the dawn of a new age where victory is measured not in courage alone, but in capacity and mass production? The answer, as we will see, is in the skies themselves, where the age of the ace has definitively given way to the era of industrial certainty. On the 18th of August in the year 1943, at an altitude of 25,000 feet above the German town of Schweinfurt, a chilling scene unfolded that would etch itself into the annals of aerial warfare history. The oxygen mask of the German pilot, Heinzko, had frozen solid against his face, a stark reminder of the harsh conditions faced in high-altitude combat. As he gazed through the canopy of his aircraft, he was confronted with a view so astonishing that it defied all rational understanding. The situation for German pilots like Kanoki had become seemingly insurmountable, entailing a struggle against overwhelming odds. In the early morning light, a mere 40 German fighters had taken to the skies from various bases scattered across southern Germany, tasked with intercepting an enormous and formidable aerial force. At this altitude, the atmosphere was crystalline and clear, revealing an awe-inspiring sight. A vast formation of 376 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses divided between the targets of Schweinfurt and Regensburg. These colossal bombers appeared as a shimmering silver glacier, slowly flowing across the sky, a moving mountain range of metal and fire. Their surfaces, meticulously polished, reflected the midday sun in blinding, dazzling sheets of light, creating a spectacle that was as beautiful as it was terrifying. Each of these bombers was heavily armed, outfitted with approximately 1,350 caliber machine guns, positioned strategically to defend against attack from any direction. The aircraft moved in precise, disciplined formations known as combat boxes, which interlocked to form a formidable barrier of firepower. This arrangement was designed to generate walls of lead, capable of annihilating any enemy fighter daring to approach. Among the defending German units was the Jagdgeschwader 11, led by NOK, and supported by elements from Jagdgeschwader 1 and Jagdgeschwader 26. These units faced a reality that mocked their courage and skill, a mere 40 fighters against an overwhelming swarm of American aircraft numbering in the hundreds. The odds confronting these German pilots were so stark that what might have once been dismissed as mere propaganda, claims of overwhelming Allied air power, had become the grim, daily reality of life in the Luftwaffe's defense of the Reich. The sight that Kanoki and his fellow pilots witnessed that August morning was not just a routine air raid. It was the stark, tangible proof of American industrial and technological supremacy. This supremacy would, in the course of the following months, ultimately drown the Third Reich in a relentless tide of destruction. The transformation from German aerial dominance, which had been so decisive in the early years of the war, to the almost complete annihilation of German air power, unfolded with startling speed between the years 1943 and 1944. When the Wehrmacht had swept across Europe in 1940, German fighters and bombers ruled the skies with near absolute authority. By August of 1943, however, the situation had reversed so profoundly that many German pilots would later describe it as witnessing their entire world suddenly flipping upside down, a catastrophic and rapid collapse of their aerial supremacy. By mid-1943, the scope and scale of American bombing campaigns had expanded to such an extent that German military strategists had never even envisioned such a possibility. The mission on the 17th of August, which would later be formally designated as Mission 84, marked a new phase in strategic bombing warfare. Led by Colonel Curtis Lame's 4th Bombardment Wing, a force of 146 B-17 bombers targeted the Messerschmitt factory in Regensburg, a crucial hub for German aircraft production. Simultaneously, a force of 230 bombers from the 1st Bombardment Wing launched a strike on the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. These targets were no random selections. They were the very heart of the German war machine. The importance of ball bearings was well understood by the Allies. They were deemed a critical bottleneck in German war production. Without them, German machinery, especially aircraft and tanks, could not operate effectively. The Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg alone produced nearly 1/3 of all German single-engine fighters, making it a prime target in the strategic campaign to cripple the Luftwaffe. The Allied strategic goal was clear: to destroy Germany's capacity to produce fighters and to undermine overall war production by inducing severe shortages of essential components such as ball bearings. In response, German Fighter Command, led by the legendary Adolf Galland, scrambled every available aircraft to defend these vital targets. The units involved included JG-1 Usau, which launched from Dan and Schiphol, JG-11 from Jeh and Oldenburg, and JG-26, known as Schlagata, from Lille and Velgem. These elite units of the Luftwaffe, comprising men who bore the prestigious Knight's Crosses and Oak Leaves, had previously dominated the skies over France, Britain, and Russia. Their experience, skill, and courage had long been legendary, yet had developed increasingly desperate tactics in an attempt to break through the formidable defenses of the American bomber formations. Among these innovations, one of the most daring and groundbreaking was pioneered by none other than the legendary German pilot known as No himself. He was the first in aviation history to successfully destroy an enemy aircraft by dropping a bomb from his fighter plane directly onto the bomber formation from above. On the 22nd of March in the year 1943, he achieved this feat, successfully downing a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress by this novel method. In his memoir titled I Flew for the Führer, No himself vividly described the experimental nature of these attacks, emphasizing his unwavering determination to discover new tactics capable of shattering the increasingly resilient defensive boxes that the Americans had perfected. These tactics, however, were but mere pinpricks against the ever-expanding presence of American air power, which seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. By the 14th of October in the year 1943, known as Black Thursday, the situation for the German Luftwaffe grew even more dire. During the second massive raid against Schweinfurt, a staggering 291 B-17 bombers crossed deep into German airspace, marking one of the most intense clashes of the entire aerial campaign. In a last-ditch effort, the Luftwaffe scrambled over 300 fighters from 24 different airfields to intercept this formidable enemy force. Among these fighters, Major Heinz Behr's 2nd JG-1, flying with their formidable Focke-Wulf FW-190S equipped with WGR-21 rockets, took to the skies in a desperate bid for survival. Similarly, JG-11 launched from their bases at Ye and Oldenburg, with aircraft marked by their distinctive yellow Reich defense bands, which set them apart from JG-1's red markings. The German pilots managed to achieve what appeared to be a significant victory. They shot down 60 American bombers, which translated into a loss rate of approximately 20.6%, a figure that compelled the Americans to temporarily suspend their deep penetration raids into German territory. Yet this apparent success came at a catastrophic cost for the Luftwaffe. Between 35 and 38 fighters were lost during the engagement, including irreplaceable veteran pilots whose combat experience was invaluable and cannot be replaced. Among these fallen heroes was Hedman Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz Gallen, the younger brother of the famed Adolf Gallen, who was killed when his FW-190 was struck by defensive fire. These brave men represented hundreds of hours of combat experience, skill, and leadership, assets that Germany could never replenish once lost. Each Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress was a marvel of defensive engineering, equipped with formidable armament arranged for maximum coverage. The tactical formation known as the combat box, comprising between 18 and 21 aircraft flying in close mutual support, was designed to unleash devastating firepower against attacking fighters. This innovative formation, refined through brutal and bloody combat experience, made frontal attacks by fighters suicidal and beam attacks extremely perilous. German fighters, despite their excellent individual capabilities, such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190A4, found it increasingly difficult to reach their targets. The introduction of the American P-47 Thunderbolt with drop tanks extended the reach of American fighter escorts deep into German-held airspace by late 1943. By the time the P-51 Mustangs appeared over Berlin itself in March of the following year, German fighters found themselves fighting for mere survival even before reaching the bomber streams. This desperate situation led to remarkable and often audacious innovations born of necessity. One such tactic was the infamous Sturmgruppe concept, involving specially armored FW-190 fighters designed to close rapidly to point-blank range before unleashing their 30mm cannons. An almost suicidal assault. When their ammunition was expended, pilots were sometimes expected to ram the bombers themselves, turning their aircraft into deadly projectiles. These Sturker attacks demanded extraordinary courage. Pilots would fly reinforced fighters directly through the bomber formations, sometimes literally slicing off wings or tails with their propellers in a brutal attempt to disrupt the enemy's defenses. The story of Germany's elite fighter units encapsulates this desperation and heroism in microcosm. For example, the unit known as Jagdgeschwader's Ursa exemplified this decline, embodying the struggle of seasoned veterans fighting against overwhelming odds and dwindling resources. A staggering 124,000 barrels of fuel daily in the early months of 1944, providing nearly 92% of all aviation fuel needed for the German war effort. These vital facilities, crucial to maintaining the operational capacity of the Luftwaffe, became primary targets for relentless Allied bombing campaigns beginning in May of the same year. On May the 12th of 1944, a massive force of nearly 1,000 aircraft, including bombers from the 8th and 15th Air Forces, launched a devastating strike against Germany's synthetic oil plants. The immediate aftermath was catastrophic. The production of aviation fuel plummeted from a peak of approximately 175,000 tons in April to just over 52,000 tons in June, then further declined to around 35,000 tons in July and finally to a mere 5,000 tons by September. The impact was so profound that Albert Schar, a prominent aviation analyst, reported in July that approximately 98% of all Axis fuel plants had been rendered inoperative. A bitter irony underscored this tragedy. Despite the destruction of fuel production, German aircraft manufacturing reached unprecedented levels, with production figures soaring to nearly 39,870 aircraft in 1944, including over 24,981 fighters. The monthly output of fighters peaked at more than 3,300 units in September of that year. Yet paradoxically, these aircraft remained largely idle, paralyzed by a severe shortage of fuel and the almost complete collapse of trained pilots capable of flying them effectively. Ground crews, desperate to conserve what little fuel remained, resorted to unusual methods such as using oxen to move aircraft on airfields, a stark testament to the dire straits of German military logistics. By November of the same year, the situation had deteriorated so drastically that all training flights were suspended altogether. Pilots operated on only about 10% of the minimum fuel needed for standard training, and most were restricted to a single flight per month. By February of the following year, the production of synthetic fuel had fallen to a fraction, less than 0.5% of what it had been in early 1944. The psychological toll on German fighter pilots was equally devastating. Veterans who had entered the war confident in their skills gradually succumbed to a fatalistic outlook, realizing that victory was slipping beyond their grasp. Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful aces, with a total of 176 confirmed victories, vividly described this transformation in his memoirs. He recounted how, in 1940, they were hunters, confident and aggressive, but by 1943, they found themselves the hunted, overwhelmed by the relentless onslaught of Allied aircraft. By 1944, they had become mere targets, their once formidable air force reduced to a shadow of its former self. The disparity in production and capability between the Allies and Germany became glaringly evident. While German fighter production, despite efforts to ramp up, peaked at nearly 40,000 aircraft in 1944, this figure was dwarfed by American output, which surpassed 96,000 aircraft during the same year. The Allies had established a formidable advantage, an almost insurmountable gap that rendering German fighter units increasingly irrelevant. The collapse of Germany's training system proved even more disastrous than the losses sustained in combat. Before the war, the German pilot training regimen was exemplary, requiring over 250 hours of flying, including aerobatics, formation flying, and gunnery practice. However, by 1944, this had diminished to just over 112 hours, often incomplete due to fuel shortages and logistical failures. In stark contrast, American pilots received more than 300 hours of flight training before entering combat, arriving fully prepared for the rigors of frontline engagement. Johannes Steinhoff, reflecting on this tragic decline, remarked that they received young men, boys really, who had perhaps only 100 hours of total flying experience, with a mere 10 hours on the Bf-109. The expectation was to ready them for combat within 2 weeks, but most were dead within their first 5 missions, illustrating the deadly cycle of attrition. The statistics confirm this grim reality. During the first half of 1943, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 1,100 fighter planes pilots, about 60% of its strength, while by 1944, monthly pilot casualties soared to around 25%, leading to a complete turnover of fighter units every 4 months. Only the most experienced commanders managed to retain any semblance of continuity, as most pilots had between 8 and 30 days of active service before succumbing to death or injury. The Allied strategic oil campaign delivered the final blow to Germany's war effort. Their synthetic fuel plants, which produced a staggering 124,000 barrels daily in early 1944, were targeted relentlessly, leading to their near-total destruction. This catastrophic loss of fuel capacity crippled the German military's ability to operate effectively. The reduction in available aviation fuel was so severe that despite producing nearly 40,000 aircraft in 1944, in the early months of the year 1944, German synthetic fuel production reached an astonishing peak, with an estimated daily output of approximately 124,000 barrels. This colossal figure was crucial, as it supplied roughly 92% of all aviation fuel needed for the German war effort at that time. These vital fuel-producing facilities had become prime targets for Allied strategic bombing campaigns, beginning in the month of May. On May the 12th, a massive force of nearly 935 bombers launched a devastating attack on the synthetic oil plants, aiming to cripple Germany's fuel supply and consequently its air power. The immediate aftermath of this assault was nothing short of catastrophic for the German war machine. The once robust fuel production plummeted from an April high of about 175,000 tons down to just over 52,000 tons in June. The downward trend continued sharply, with July's output falling to approximately 35,000 tons, and by September it had dwindled to a mere 5,000 tons, a fraction of its former capacity. In July, Albert Schar, a German military observer, reported with grim certainty that nearly all of the Axis powers fuel plants, about 98%, were rendered inoperative. This situation was bitterly ironic. Despite the fuel shortage, German aircraft production numbers soared to unprecedented levels. In the year 1944, Germany produced approximately 39,870 aircraft, including a staggering 24,981 fighters. The monthly output of fighters reached its zenith in September, with over 3,300 units manufactured. Yet these aircraft remain largely idle, hamstrung by the lack of sufficient fuel to operate them and the shortage of well-trained pilots capable of flying them effectively. To conserve the scarce fuel resources, German ground crews, desperate and resourceful, resorted to using oxen to move aircraft on airfields, a stark symbol of the dire straits in which the Luftwaffe found itself. By November of 1944, all flying training flights had been completely halted, as fuel shortages became critical. The combat units found themselves operating on only about 10% of the minimum fuel required for sustained operations, and pilots were restricted to conducting a single training flight per month. By the beginning of February 1945, synthetic fuel production had fallen to a staggering 0.5% of the levels recorded in early 1944, signaling the near-total collapse of Germany's aviation fuel supply. This depletion inflicted psychological damage on the German fighter pilots long before it caused their physical destruction. Men who had entered the war full of confidence and bravado gradually transformed into fatalistic survivors, resigned to their impending doom. Johannes Steinhoff vividly described this transformation in his memoirs, recalling that in 1940 they were still hunters, but by 1941-43 they had become the hunted, and by 1944 they were merely targets moving through the skies. He chronicled how the realization slowly spread through fighter units that the war was already lost, and that their leaders had abandoned every standard of responsible conduct. The situation reached its breaking point in a dramatic revolt by German fighter pilots on January the 22nd, 1945. The most decorated aces of the Luftwaffe, Adolf Galland, Johannes Steinhoff, Galuzzo, and Hannes Trautloff, confronted Hermann Göring at his residence in Berlin. This unprecedented mutiny by the top fighter pilots symbolized the complete disintegration of trust between frontline personnel and their commanders. The pilots voiced specific grievances, including accusations of cowardice, despite facing impossible odds, accusations of operational incompetence, and the dismissal of Galland from his position as general of fighters. Steinhoff, in particular, confronted Göring directly, insisting that the new jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me 262, must be deployed immediately to harass and inflict losses on the American bomber streams. Göring's response was shockingly disconnected from reality. He accused the pilots of treason and threatened their execution. When evidence was presented, namely wreckage of P-51 Mustangs shot down over Germany, Göring dismissed it as impossible, claiming those aircraft must have glided in from outside German airspace. Instead of punishing the mutineers, the Nazi leadership chose to elevate them to hero status. Galland and others were disbanded or banished, with Galland himself being sent to command units in Italy, while Steinhoff was barred from entering Luftwaffe airfields, and Trautloff was removed from his post. The Allied forces' strategic bombing campaign, known as Operation Argument or Big Week, delivered the decisive blow to Germany's war effort. From February the 20th to the 25th of 1944, over 3,000 bomb sorties were flown by the United States 8th Air Force, while the 15th Air Force contributed 500 missions, complemented by Royal Air Force raids. Superiority, a marvel of engineering that should have revolutionized the air war. Capable of reaching speeds up to 540 miles per hour, it was the world's first operational jet fighter, surpassing Allied aircraft by a significant margin and promising a new era of aerial dominance for Germany. Yet despite the advanced technology and the initial excitement surrounding its deployment, the Me-262's potential was ultimately undermined by strategic errors, logistical delays, and shortages of fuel and trained pilots. Germany produced approximately 1,430 of these jets, but Hitler's insistence on using them as bombers instead of fighters delayed their full introduction into combat until late in the war, when their impact was already diminished. When General Adolf Galland, a leading German ace and fighter pilot, finally had the chance to fly the Me-262, he famously described the sensation as feeling as though angels were pushing the aircraft through the skies, a testament to its remarkable performance. However, Hitler's sole concern was its payload capacity, and even when the jets were finally authorized as fighters, a combination of fuel shortages and inadequate training limited their operational numbers. The German Air Force's fighter units, such as Jagdgeschwader 7, could rarely deploy more than 30 of these advanced aircraft at once, often struggling to keep pace with the overwhelming numbers of Allied bombers and fighters. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June the 6th in the year of 1944 exposed the full extent of German aviation's collapse. Despite years of preparation, the Luftwaffe had only around 100 fighters available for the critical D-Day operations, a figure woefully insufficient against the nearly 12,000 sorties launched by the Allies that day. The few remaining German fighters, including the prominent wing of Jagdgeschwader 26 led by Oberleutnant Isef Pips Priller, found themselves hopelessly outnumbered and outmatched. Priller's account of the invasion vividly captures the futility. He remembered taking off with only 8 aircraft, only 2 of which managed to return after engaging the enemy, as the sky filled with American Mustangs. Throughout the course of the war, the German fighter pilot losses mounted to catastrophic levels. By the end of the conflict, approximately 26,800 fighter pilots had been killed or listed as missing, a staggering human toll that far exceeded the capacity for replacement. The attrition rate was relentless. In some months, losses reached nearly 25%, meaning entire units were being decimated every 4 months. This rapid turnover meant that most pilots had only weeks, sometimes just a handful of days of combat experience before they were killed, wounded, or captured. The once elite Luftwaffe pilots, who had been the most skilled and experienced in the world at the start of the war, found themselves increasingly powerless as the material and logistical disadvantages overwhelmed their tactical prowess. The strategic situation deteriorated even further as the Allies launched relentless bombing campaigns targeting Germany's vital industrial infrastructure. The destruction of synthetic fuel plants, which produced the majority of the Reich's aviation gasoline, producing around 124,000 barrels daily in early 1944, became a primary objective. These facilities, including the crucial synthetic oil plants, were subjected to repeated heavy bombardments beginning in May of that year. On May the 12th, a force of nearly 1,355 American bombers, escorted by over 800 fighters, struck these vital targets, causing immediate and devastating declines in fuel production. The result was catastrophic. By June, production plummeted from 175,000 tons of fuel per month to less than 53,000, and by September, it had fallen to a mere 5,000 tons. The irony of this situation was stark. While aircraft production in Germany reached unprecedented heights, with nearly 40,000 aircraft manufactured in 1944, the fuel shortages and the loss of trained pilots rendered these machines useless. The Germans, desperate to conserve what little fuel remained, resorted to moving aircraft on airfields with oxen and other primitive means, as the ground crews faced the grim reality that most of their planes could not take to the skies. By November of 1944, flight training was suspended entirely, and the remaining operational fighters flew on a fraction of the fuel required for sustained combat. The situation was so dire that by February of the following year, synthetic fuel production had dwindled to just 0.5% of its early 1944 levels, sealing the fate of the German air war effort. The psychological toll on German pilots was profound. Veterans who had entered the war full of confidence and fighting spirit gradually transformed into resigned, fatalistic survivors. Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful pilots with a record of 176 victories, vividly described this shift in his memoirs. In his words, the Germans had gone from being the hunters in the skies to the hunted, and eventually to mere targets. This sense of inevitable defeat was reinforced by the grim statistics. In the first half of the combined efforts of British and Soviet manufacturing, the disparity in industrial capacity was staggering, an insurmountable gulf that rendered any German hopes of maintaining parity utterly futile. Despite the lofty ambitions and technological innovations that the Germans managed to develop, the sheer scale of American and Allied production overwhelmed their efforts. In the year of 1944 alone, the United States manufactured approximately 96,318 aircraft, a number that dwarfed the German output of just under 40,398, even after accounting for the reforms and increased efforts undertaken by Speer and his team. This meant that, on average, the United States was producing over 265 aircraft each day, a relentless industrial juggernaut that Germany simply could not match, regardless of the ingenuity or heroism of its pilots and engineers. Moreover, the British and Soviet aircraft production figures, when combined with American totals, created a total output that was roughly 4 times greater than Germany's capacity, an overwhelming advantage that made the German military's strategic and tactical efforts appear almost hopelessly outmatched. The disparity was not merely a matter of numbers, it was an existential threat to Germany's war effort. Even as the German aircraft industry reached its peak in 1944, producing nearly 40,000 aircraft, the critical shortages of fuel and trained pilots meant that these machines sat idle, unable to be deployed effectively. The fuel shortage in particular was catastrophic, as the synthetic fuel plants, Germany's lifeline, had been targeted relentlessly by Allied bombers, leading to a dramatic and inexorable decline in fuel supplies from early 1944 onward. By the end of that year, the situation had become dire. Despite the high production figures, only a fraction of these aircraft could be flown. Most of Germany's fighters and bombers remained grounded due to the lack of fuel, and the pilots who survived the brutal attrition rates had insufficient training and experience, further crippling their combat effectiveness. The once formidable Luftwaffe was now a shadow of its former self, with its operational strength dwindling rapidly. As the year progressed into 1945, the remaining aircraft were often used sparingly, with most pilots flying only a handful of missions before being killed, wounded, or captured. The once proud German Air Force had been reduced to a mere shell of its former glory, its potential squandered by strategic miscalculations, logistical failures, and the relentless onslaught of Allied industrial might. The psychological toll on German pilots was profound and far-reaching. Veterans who had entered the war filled with confidence and a sense of invincibility gradually transformed into disillusioned survivors who understood that victory was no longer within reach. Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's most successful aces with a total of 176 confirmed kills, vividly described this transformation in his memoirs. He recounted how, in the early days of the war, they were the hunters, confident in their skill and superiority. But by 1943, they had become the hunted, pursued relentlessly by numbers and technology they could no longer match. By 1944, they were merely targets, sitting ducks in a battlefield dominated by the industrial strength of their enemies. This grim realization culminated in the infamous fighter pilots' revolt on the 22nd of January in the year 1945. Germany's most decorated aces, including Adolf Galland, Johannes Steinhoff, and Hannes Trimpel, confronted Hermann Göring at his residence in Berlin, demanding an end to the senseless sacrifices and urging the release of the new jet fighters, specifically the Messerschmitt Me-262, into combat roles. This act of rebellion was unprecedented and symbolized the complete breakdown of trust and morale within the German Air Force. The pilots, who had once been the pride of the Luftwaffe and the scourge of Allied skies, now saw their leadership as disconnected and incapable of turning the tide. Göring's response was brutal. He accused the pilots of treason and threatened their execution, revealing his complete detachment from the reality of the battlefield. Despite the efforts to rally their forces, the Germans' strategic situation was hopeless. The groundbreaking jet fighters, which could reach speeds of over 540 miles per hour, about 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter, had arrived too late and in too limited numbers to alter the course of the war. When Galland demonstrated the capabilities of the Me-262, he famously remarked that it felt as though angels were pushing, a testament to the aircraft's revolutionary design and performance. Yet Hitler, obsessed with the bomb capacity of these machines, showed little interest in their potential as fighters, and only when final permission was granted did their operational deployment begin. Unfortunately, by that time, fuel shortages and inadequate training meant that only a handful of these advanced aircraft could be flown at once. On the 16th of June in 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy, D-Day, demonstrated conclusively the Luftwaffe's complete collapse. By the early months of March in the year 1945, the once formidable German Luftwaffe found itself standing on the brink of collapse, operating under conditions that were nothing short of catastrophic. The combined might of the Allies, particularly the British Royal Air Force and the Soviet Air Force, had created a staggering 4-to-1 disadvantage in aircraft production that Germany simply could not surmount. This overwhelming disparity in manufacturing capacity, coupled with the relentless attrition of experienced pilots and aircraft, had rendered the Luftwaffe effectively powerless by this point in the war. In reality, of the over 1,000 fighters that were supposedly available at the outset of this period, only a fraction, perhaps no more than 100, could be flown on any given day. The severe shortage of fuel, a critical resource, meant that each pilot was limited to a single sortie per week at best, a stark contrast to the intensive flying schedules of earlier years. Most of these pilots had accumulated less than 50 hours of flight time, a figure that starkly illustrates how depleted the Luftwaffe's pilot training and operational readiness had become. Heinz Kocha, a German fighter pilot, flew what would be his final mission on the 18th day of March, 1945. His personal diary offers a poignant and unvarnished glimpse into the bleak reality faced by German airmen during these final days. His writings describe aircraft worn and battered from relentless combat, pilots exhausted to the point of physical and mental collapse, fuel tanks nearly empty, and the haunting awareness that victory was no longer within reach. The mathematical inevitability of defeat, which had become painfully clear since 1943, had now reached its unavoidable conclusion. Throughout the entire conflict, the Luftwaffe had lost approximately 76,875 aircraft, of which around 43,000 had been destroyed in combat. These figures represent not just material losses, but human tragedy of staggering proportions. About 165,000 German aircrew had been killed, another 155,000 wounded, and nearly 200,000 either missing or captured. In stark contrast, the United States Army Air Forces had suffered some 26,000 killed from a total of over 350,000 personnel who served. These losses, though grievous, were considered sustainable given the scale of American industrial and military resources. The critical factor that sealed Germany's fate was the insurmountable production gap. In the year 1944 alone, the Allies manufactured an astonishing 163,199 aircraft, vastly outnumbering the German output of just 39,870. No matter how much courage and skill German pilots possessed, they could not compensate for such a disparity in industrial capacity. The destruction of the Luftwaffe serves as a lasting lesson about the brutal realities of modern industrial warfare. German pilots, who were initially the most highly trained and experienced in the world, were not defeated because of a lack of bravery or skill. Instead, their downfall was driven by one simple, undeniable truth: the relentless march of mathematical inevitability fueled by overwhelming Allied production. The American strategy of mass production, combined with adequate training that allowed for many losses, proved far more effective than relying solely on the individual brilliance of German aces. While German pilots accumulated impressive combat scores, their victories could not alter the overarching outcome dictated by the stark facts of production statistics. When faced with those enormous formations of American bombers, an unthinkable sight for German veterans, many realized that they were witnessing a new form of warfare, one dominated by industrial might. These skies, once the playground of skilled hunters, had transformed into a metallic ocean of silver bombers stretching as far as the eye could see. This metallic tide was not merely a symbol of military defeat, but also a signpost marking the end of an era, the era of German aerial supremacy. The shift from the hunter to the hunted happened with startling speed. In 1940, German fighters had dominated European skies, sweeping away opposition with ease. Yet by 1944, they could scarcely defend their own airfields against the overwhelming force arrayed against them. This was not a gradual decline, but a catastrophic collapse, a swift unraveling of their aerial dominance. The fighter pilots' revolt in January of the year 1945 was the final act of acknowledgement by those who had long refused to accept the reality of defeat. When Germany's most renowned aces, those who had once been celebrated for their skill, confronted Hermann Göring and told him that the war was lost, that continuing the fight would only lead to pointless death, they voiced what every pilot understood deep down. They understood that individual heroism, no matter how impressive, could not overcome the systemic superiority of the Allies' industrial and military might. By this point, German pilots flew their aircraft knowing they were already defeated, aware that their sacrifices would make no difference in the ultimate outcome. Yet they continued to fly, driven by duty, ingrained habit, or simply because they had no other choice. In the final analysis, the German pilots who confronted those overwhelming waves of bomber armadas did not merely lose a conventional war. They bore witness to a profound and irreversible transformation of warfare itself, one that had evolved into an intricate and relentless industrial calculus, where victory was dictated not by skill or valor alone, but by systemic, mathematical inevitability. Their testimonies serve as a stark historical record, capturing the moment when the battlefield ceased to be a place of personal heroism and became a domain governed by the ruthless laws of production, capacity, and logistical supremacy. These brave men fought against the certainty of numbers, of massed steel, and relentless machinery, and in doing so, they lost not because of a deficit in courage or expertise, but because they faced an adversary that had fundamentally redefined war as a matter of industrial mathematics. Throughout the years of 1943 to 1945, German fighter pilots learned this brutal lesson in the harshest of circumstances through blood, sacrifice, and often tragic loss. They discovered that once the skies are filled with an overwhelming abundance of metal, vast formations of bombers supported by a sky-darkening fleet of fighters, the individual warrior's significance diminishes to near insignificance. The era of the lone ace, the skilled hunter capable of shaping the course of aerial battles with personal prowess, had come to its inevitable end. Instead, what had taken hold was the age of mass production, a relentless, industrialized engine designed to produce not just aircraft, but victory itself through sheer volume and capacity. This new era was characterized by the dominance of overwhelming numerical superiority, where victory was no longer a matter of individual heroism, but a function of vast factories, relentless manufacturing, and strategic planning that prioritized quantity over quality. The skies, once the domain of personal combat and daring exploits, had transformed into a theater where the outcome was almost predetermined by the relentless march of industrial might. In this new landscape of warfare, the concept of the heroic pilot embodying skill, daring, and personal achievement was rendered almost obsolete by the impersonal power of mass production and overwhelming numbers. The tragic irony was that these pilots, brave and highly trained, faced a reality where their individual efforts could not sway the tide of a war dictated by systemic, industrial forces. Their stories, etched into history, stand as poignant testimony to the profound shift. When the sky is filled with enough metal, an unstoppable tide of bombers and fighters, the fate of nations hinges not on individual valor, but on the unyielding calculations of industrial capacity. Thus, the conclusion is inescapable. The age of the ace, once a symbol of personal skill and daring, had definitively ended. The dawn of the era marked by mass production, where victory was dictated by factories and numbers, had irrevocably begun. The skies no longer belong solely to the individual warrior. They belong to the collective might of industry and manufacturing, shaping the course of history with relentless mathematical certainty.